Some say the mountains are where we find solace. Others believe they harbor mysteries. But for Esther Dingley, they were more than that. They were her sanctuary, her canvas, and tragically, her final chapter. What really happened to Esther in the Pyrenees? Did she vanish without a trace? Or is there something more sinister at play? Join us to find out what actually went down. Before we continue, let's take a step back and go down memory lane. Esther Dingley met the love of her life, Dan Colegate, in the walls of Oxford University in Durham. It was like a dream come true for both of them. They had similar interests and enjoyed each other's company. Dan loved the outdoor life and didn't hesitate to invite Esther to go with him on the weekends. The lovebirds would hike and bike together, visiting the most amazing places and taking in all the scenery. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. As a matter of fact, all was well for quite some time. In 2014, 11 years after they started dating, they decided it was high time to get married. They had gotten a nice place in Durham and were doing pretty good financially. They were both graduates with a number of degrees, so apparently getting jobs was never a problem for either of them. Dan worked as a business development manager, and Esther was doing her thing. She established a personal training business. From an outsider's perspective, it was all sunshines and rainbows. How do two people go from living the life of their dreams to one that is filled with sadness? I'll tell you how. During this period, Dan was suffering from severe depression. We don't really know what caused it. Everything seemed fine in their lives at the time. To make things worse, Esther was suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. In case you don't know about it, chronic fatigue syndrome involves prolonged fatigue most of the time, and it can last over 6 months. The fatigue gradually gets worse with time and more activity. Sleeping won't help, so it's a pretty hopeless situation. It can be managed, but there is no cure for it. Interestingly, even after they both got to know their challenges and unfortunate situations, they still stuck together and got on with their lives. They clearly never considered having children or even thought about what it would be like to have another person in the picture, so their life was starting to look bland. They would go to work in the morning, come back in the evening, eat, and sleep. Next day, the same thing, over and over again. As most of us know, this repetitive kind of life can be very exhausting, but I think the couple just went on with it. This continued until one fateful day in that same year, 2014. Dan was booked for surgery. He wanted to get rid of an issue that he had with his gut since childhood. Everything went as planned, and the surgery was a success. But when Dan was leaving the hospital, he took a big problem along with him. He contracted necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacteria. The bacteria had eaten into his guts and almost killed him. He was on the brink of death when Esther had been called to see him one last time. But somehow, by a miracle, Dan made it out alive. After this incident, they both got a wake-up call. Esther realized how she could have lost her man overnight, and Dan didn't need anyone to remind him of what dying without living a fulfilled life looks like. After their epiphany, guess what they decided to do with their time? Hiking. They decided to go back to doing the things they both love so much. 3 weeks after the incident with Dan, they hit the road and were ready to live a nomadic lifestyle. When they were making plans for their little adventure, they had decided on 1 year of fun, but 1 year passed and their friends and coworkers didn't see them. 2 years passed and they were still off the grid. With time, what was initially a 1-year trip became 6 years. You might be wondering how they were able to fund this unusual life since both of them were not working. Well, they rented out their property in the UK and worked at different places whenever they got to somewhere new. Besides, the two of them had opened a YouTube channel and started vlogging. Every time they found somewhere nice during their hikes, they would take a quick shot and a few videos. This was how they lived for 6 good years. This is what they always wanted. They were truly free. Everything was going great till things took a dark turn in November of 2020. In that month, Dan decided to take a break from all the hiking and continue writing the book he was working on in France. Rather than stay with her husband, Esther decided to go on a trip to the mountains alone. She took the van and stayed in Spain, getting ready for her hiking trip. She planned to climb the terrain between Port de la Claire and Port de Venasque. I'm guessing she wanted to give him some space, but little did anyone know that that would be her mistake. The distance from ground level to the mountain's peak was over 8 miles, but from what we've heard from other hikers, the climb is pretty easy. According to Dan, Esther occasionally kept him posted on her whereabouts. By the 22nd of November, Esther had reached the mountain's peak. She was elated and picked up her phone to have a quick chat with Dan. The couple spoke for 90 seconds through a video call, with Esther showing Dan the beautiful view. At this point, if anyone told Dan that this would be the last time he would set his eyes on her, he wouldn't believe them. Esther took some photos on the spot and sent them to Dan. She switched off her phone minutes later to save battery. After this, there was radio silence. No one heard from Esther. Neither Dan nor her close friends had any idea of her whereabouts. There was no cause for alarm until the 24th of November, when Dan was expecting a call from Esther at an earlier agreed time. They never missed each other's calls, so Dan had the feeling that something was wrong. He quickly went on to inform the French and Spanish authorities, and just like that, the search began. As the days passed, there were a number of speculations surrounding her whereabouts. A stranger even claimed that she had seen her stop to get something from the market. After checking the CCTVs, they were able to find out that she had visited a Spanish store before going for her hike, but there was no record of her coming back on camera. It raised the question, was Esther murdered? If she was, the killer must have done a good job at hiding her body, because a large search party was made for the sole purpose of finding her. In this search party, there were over 30 experienced officers, and Dan himself. They eagerly searched, hoping to find any trace of her, or at least something to work with. Dan and his buddies had covered over 700 miles, and still no sign of her. Drones had to be used because it was hard to believe that a human would just vanish like that. Before then, the officer had assumed that she had an accident or had been killed, but those theories were no longer making any sense since there was no sign of a body. Was Esther abducted? There was still no way to tell, but it did seem likely. As the months passed, the situation began to look more hopeless. Winter came, and the search had to stop. But even after that, Dan didn't relent. Immediately, the winter passed and spring came, and he got up and went to keep looking for his girl. The piece of evidence that provided the answers wasn't discovered by Dan. It was found by mountain runners who came across a bone remnant on their way. Forensics said that it was from a human skull, Esther's skull. This made everyone certain that they were moving in the right direction. During the last days of July, Dan set his eyes on what might have been the most horrific thing for anyone in his situation to behold. He saw his dead wife's corpse. However, he wasn't certain at the time, and went on to report his findings. Later, on the 6th of August, it was discovered that the bones belonged to Esther, and she had fallen from the peak of the mountain. After assessing the possible causes of the incident, they found out that the soles of Esther's boots were smooth due to frequent use, and she had fallen from a height of almost 1,000 meters. That's why it was so difficult to find her body. Weeks later, Esther's body was cremated, and her ashes were spread. It's a sad story, and her death hit hard, but at least Esther Dingley died doing something she loved. And that's the wrap. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more captivating content on tragic real-life events, and share your thoughts in the comments below.